Something very serious is happening before your eyes, and most people just don't realize it. You may think you've seen it all, that you understand how the world works, but the truth is that there's an invisible influence operating behind the scenes, shaping what you believe, what you feel, and even what you fear. Worst of all, this is not a conspiracy theory, it's not fiction, it's real. What if I told you that what you watch for fun may be opening doors that you should never cross, that the sights, sounds, and stories that seem like just entertainment carry a much greater weight than you might think? There is a pattern in all of this, a pattern that no one is telling you, but if you ignore this warning, it may be too late. What we are going to reveal here is not for the faint-hearted. What you see can be disturbing. It can change the way you see movies, series, culture, and even the reality around you. But if you go out now, if you close your eyes to it, you are becoming part of the problem. You will continue to live without knowing how this influence works, without understanding what is really happening in the world, and without knowing how to protect yourself. So, if you want the truth, get ready. Because this video is not just information, it is a warning. And the decision to listen or ignore it can affect much more than you think. Humanity has always had a curious relationship with horror and the unknown. In a world where logic and science are increasingly exalted, many people scoff at the idea of Satan's existence, possession, and spiritual warfare. But at the same time, these same people avidly consume movies, series, and books that depict the occult and the confrontation between good and evil. Sounds strange, doesn't it? If the devil does not exist, why are so many attracted to narratives that revolve around him? This contradiction is a reflection of modern society. While many dismiss belief in the supernatural, there is an almost hypnotic fascination with the topic, especially when evil is portrayed in a terrifying way. Entertainment has become a powerful tool for normalizing the presence of evil in popular culture. Films like The Exorcist, Hereditary, and The Witch explore the primal fear of the unknown and the influence of evil forces, but interestingly, few reflect on what they are consuming. The point here is not just to have fun with a good story, but to understand that the repetition of certain images and concepts can affect the perception of reality. When horror becomes commonplace, sensitivity to distinguish spiritual danger diminishes. And the most worrying, many people don't even notice this change. In the early days of civilization, the fear of the occult kept people away from dangerous practices. Today, society seems to play with these themes without measuring the consequences. What was once avoided out of pure respect or fear has now become an entertainment fetish. Exorcism rituals, pacts with the devil, spiritual invocations, all of this has come to be treated as mere fiction, when in reality there are historical records and testimonies that such practices actually exist. What was once seen as taboo has now become a trend, and here comes a curious aspect. Many of these productions claim to be based on real events. Why does this increase public interest so much? Maybe because, deep down, people feel that there is something true in these stories. The case of Annabelle, the supposedly possessed doll, or the reports of paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren are some examples of how the spirit world is more present than most imagine. Even those who say they do not believe in possession avoid playing with certain objects or participating in certain experiences. Fear of what, after all? Film and television have created a modern paradox. While ridiculing the idea of a spirit world, they promote an almost addictive fascination with stories of exorcism and evil forces. This is not just an artistic choice, but a normalization strategy. When the devil is presented as something fictitious and harmless, his influence becomes even more sneaky. Like a thief who works in the dark, deception happens just when people believe that nothing is happening. Now, an important detail. Have you ever noticed how horror movies rarely portray the power of God? The focus is almost always on the power of evil, on its strength, its capacity to destroy. But what about divine protection? The Bible tells us that good always triumphs over evil, but that's not the message you see in most film productions. Fear sells more than hope. Dread generates more profit than faith. Is this just a coincidence or part of something bigger? This exaggerated consumption of horror and the occult ends up desensitizing people. When you watch dozens of horror movies, the reaction to the supernatural changes. What used to cause astonishment is now common, and this is a problem. Spiritual warfare continues to exist, regardless of whether one believes in it or not. But those who are already used to evil do not even notice when it really approaches. This is the greatest danger, the normalization of the evil one. And mind you, this doesn't mean that watching a horror movie will automatically open a door to evil influences, but what happens when you consume this type of content without any filter? When are these ideas allowed to constantly enter the mind? Like contaminated food, the contents we ingest can poison us without us realizing it. The problem is not just seeing a movie, but how it affects the perception of the spiritual world. The greatest strategy of modern deception is not to convince people that the devil exists, but rather to make them believe that he is just an outdated concept. And if evil has become just a fictional character, what is the real danger? This is the trap. When no one believes in danger anymore, no one protects themselves from it anymore. And that's exactly what happens today. But is this evil influence limited to entertainment only, or is there something bigger going on behind the scenes in the intentions of those who produce this type of content? The impact of a movie like The Exorcist is not just about the fear it causes, but about what it represents within this spiritual war. And as we will see below, there are many strange details involving this film that go beyond what is seen on the screen. Horror has always had a peculiar appeal. There's something about the mix between fear and adrenaline that draws millions of people to movie theaters and streaming services. But is all this just entertainment? Movies that explore the occult, demonic possession, and exorcism are not just fictional stories. Many of these productions are based on real events and reports from those who have been faced with absolute evil. The curious thing is that, despite society's skepticism, Hollywood continues to bet on these themes and profit billions. If belief in the devil is a myth, why does the fascination with stories about him keep growing? The Conjuring franchise is a perfect example of this phenomenon. Based on the files of paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren, the saga features cases of possession, exorcism, and spiritual attacks that would have happened in real life. The public is terrified, but many forget that the scripts were written from documents and interviews of people who claim to have lived these experiences. If everything is nothing more than fiction, how to explain the phenomena recorded in reports and recordings during the investigations? Another film that stands out is Hereditary, 2018, which raised the level of psychological horror to the extreme. The film addresses occult rituals, invocations, and the influence of evil entities on entire families. The intense acting and oppressive atmosphere make many viewers feel uncomfortable, something that goes beyond simple scare. It is not uncommon to hear reports of people who left the session disturbed, feeling a strange presence around them. Coincidence? Or do some of these movies carry something beyond what the eye can see? And we can't forget The Witch, 2015, a film that reconstructs with historical accuracy the accounts of witchcraft in 17th century New England. Unlike modern tales that romanticize the occult, this production shows the dark side of spiritual pacts and their consequences. The script was based on old documents, historical records, and confessions of those accused of witchcraft. This means that many of the scenes in the film were inspired by real testimonies of people who claim to have dealt with evil forces. But it's not just movies based on true stories that carry this dense energy. The very act of watching content loaded with spiritual horror can have unexpected effects. Many viewers report sleep paralysis, intense nightmares, and even the feeling that something is watching them in the dark after watching certain movies. It's not just psychological fear. There are cases where unexplained phenomena happen, such as flashing lights, falling objects on their own, or the feeling of a strange presence in the environment. Horror cinema has always flirted with the supernatural, but in recent years there has been a detail that draws attention: the search for authenticity. Directors and screenwriters do not hesitate to consult demonologists and occultists to ensure that the rituals and symbols depicted on screen are as faithful as possible. In other words, what many see as just a movie may contain actual elements of occultism and entity invocation. Have you ever wondered how many people might be repeating, without realizing it, incantations that were written based on real ritualistic texts? Another interesting point is the way exorcism is represented in these films. Generally, the climax of the story happens when the ritual fails, or when evil becomes so powerful that it seems impossible to beat it. This reinforces a troubling narrative. The idea that the devil always has the upper hand while fighting him is ineffective. But this distorted view is not consistent with the Bible, which shows that authority over evil always belongs to God. The question is, why does the movie industry insist on portraying the dark side as stronger? Perhaps the answer lies in the very impact of these films. By exalting fear, they reduce people's faith in victory over spiritual evil. What was once seen as a real threat becomes just a piece of entertainment. And once terror is normalized, people become desensitized to the real danger that spiritual deception poses. Few wonder about the effect of this type of content on their lives. After all, if fear paralyzes, it also prevents reaction, and that is all the enemy needs to continue acting freely. But has horror cinema reached such a deep level of involvement with the occult that it is no longer just entertainment? If so, to what extent can it influence the viewer, even without him realizing it? Some films seem to go beyond fiction and carry a spiritual weight that transcends the screen. And there is one case in particular that has become the greatest symbol of this phenomenon: The Exorcist. The impact of this film was not limited to the cinema, but spread to the real world in a frightening way. When The Exorcist hit theaters in 1973, no one was prepared for what would come next. The film was not just another story of demonic possession. It brought something that transcended entertainment and invaded the realm of reality. From the first trailers, the reactions were intense. People fainted at the sessions, vomited from nervousness, and in some cases needed medical attention due to the extreme emotional load. Something in The Exorcist caused a visceral reaction. But what exactly made this film become a milestone in spiritual horror? Unlike conventional horror films of the time, The Exorcist did not treat the occult as a game. Every detail was thought to feel authentic, from the Latin lines in the exorcism ritual to the way the demon manipulates its victims. The director himself, William Friedkin, spared no effort to create a heavy atmosphere. The soundtrack, sound effects, and even lighting contributed to an almost unbearable sense of oppression. It was not a simple passing fright. It was an experience capable of leaving deep psychological scars. And it wasn't just the public that felt this impact. Actress Linda Blair, who played the possessed young Regan McNeil, never had peace again after the film's release. Many said she was cursed, and her life became a nightmare of harassment and threats. Some people believed that she had actually been affected spiritually during filming. After all, playing someone dominated by an evil entity is not something that can be done without consequences. The actor who played Father Merrin, Max von Sydow, reported that he felt a strange energy during the recordings. But what drew the most attention were the reports of supernatural events inside movie theaters. People claimed that they felt an intense cold, as if something was there with them. Others said they heard voices whispering in the middle of the session, even when there were no lines on the screen. In some cities, the public left terrified and went directly to churches in search of spiritual comfort. Never before had a film caused this kind of collective reaction. It was as if something invisible was accompanying each exhibition. The fear generated by The Exorcist was so intense that even those who did not believe in Satan began to question their convictions. Many people have come to avoid anything related to the occult, fearing that they might be affected in some way. Others, however, had the opposite reaction. They became obsessed with the topic and began to study rituals of exorcism and possession. The film became a gateway for many who, without realizing it, began to explore subjects that the Bible warns are dangerous. Another factor that contributed to the macabre aura of the film was the way it was promoted. Marketing used reports of strange events that occurred during filming to further increase the impact. Rumors about curses, accidents on the set, and even deaths linked to the cast were spread, creating an atmosphere of fear even before the premiere. And the curious thing, many of these events actually happened, as we will see later. Even decades later, The Exorcist remains one of the most disturbing films of all time. While modern audiences have become accustomed to horror and are hardly impressed, this film still has the power to unsettle. Perhaps because it is not just a fictional story, but rather a frightening portrait of a reality that many prefer to ignore. When the light on the screen goes out and silence takes over the room, the inevitable question arises: what if all this is real? The big issue is that The Exorcist not only showed the terror of spiritual horror, but also brought into the debate what many religions avoided discussing: the real danger of spiritual warfare. The film forced people to face the fact that if demonic possession is possible, then there is something much bigger going on in the unseen world. And this raises another question. Was the film just a work of fiction, or was there something darker behind its creation? What if the strange events that occurred during filming weren't just coincidences? If everything that happened behind the scenes was, in fact, a reflection of what was being portrayed on the screen? The behind-the-scenes accounts of The Exorcist are as disturbing as the film itself, and some details will make you question whether it should have been made. If what happened on screen with The Exorcist was already scary, the backstage of the film was even more disturbing. From the beginning of the recordings, strange events began to happen on the set, to the point that the production itself considered that something was wrong. The first major incident was an unexpected fire that destroyed practically the entire set, with the exception of Reagan's room, where the demonic possession and exorcism scenes took place. Firefighters were never able to explain the origin of the fire, and the team began to suspect that something more than simple coincidence was at play. But the fire was just the beginning. During the recordings, several actors suffered unexplained accidents. Linda Blair herself, who played Reagan, severely injured her back in a scene where she was thrown against the bed by an unseen force. The pain was so real that her screams in the film weren't acting. They were authentic reactions to the injury. Another famous case was that of actress Ellen Burstyn, who played the mother of the possessed girl. In a scene where Reagan pushes her violently, she actually fell and dislocated her spine. The scream of pain captured by the cameras was so intense that the director decided to leave it in the film. The strange events did not stop there. Actor Jack McGowran, who played Burke Dennings in the film, passed away suddenly shortly after completing his recordings. But he was not the only one. Another actress, Vasiliki Maliaros, also died unexpectedly before the film's premiere. In total, at least 9 people associated with the production died during or shortly after filming. The cast and crew began to avoid talking about it, but rumors that the film was cursed spread quickly. Another episode that put the production on alert happened when Father Thomas Birmingham, who was a religious consultant for the film, felt that something was wrong. He was called to the set to perform a blessing, and shortly after suffered a serious accident. Although he recovered, he warned the team that they were dealing with something that went beyond the cinema. Many believe that the scenes of occultism and exorcism depicted in the film may have awakened forces that should not have been disturbed. Some legends also surround the film's soundtrack. During editing, the team noticed that certain parts of the recording had strange noises, such as whispers and indecipherable voices. Some sound technicians even reported that they heard murmurs even when the speakers were off. The atmosphere of tension was so great that at various times, members of the team asked to leave the production. Some said they felt a strange presence on the set, as if they were being watched. And what about the screening of the film itself? In several cities, cinemas reported strange occurrences, such as unexplained electrical failures, and even reports of spectators who fell ill during the session. There have been cases of people who said they felt a weight in their chest, a kind of spiritual oppression, while watching the film. In a cinema in Rome, lightning struck a nearby building just as the film was starting, frightening the audience and causing many to leave the session. Interestingly, even the director himself, William Friedkin, avoided discussing the strange events that took place behind the scenes. In interviews, he acknowledged that there was something mysterious about the set, but he always tried to minimize the impact of the stories. Even so, many of those involved in the production reported that after working on the film, they felt a change in their lives, and not always for the better. In the face of so many reports, the question that remains is, was The Exorcist just a cinematographic work, or is there something more behind its creation? Are the strange events surrounding his production just coincidences, or could they be signs that certain boundaries have been crossed? What if all this was just the beginning? After all, if there is something spiritual behind these films, what would be the real intention behind their production? And that question leads us directly to a warning made by one of the greatest Christian leaders in history, Billy Graham. Not only did he warn about the dangers of The Exorcist, but he stated that the film itself contained something evil at its core. What if he was right? Billy Graham, one of the greatest evangelists of the 20th century, was quick to take a stand against The Exorcist. For him, the film was not just a work of fiction, but carried a real evil force. He even publicly declared that the devil himself is on the film tape, a statement that generated great controversy at the time. What did he mean by that? According to Graham, the film not only portrayed the occult, but served as a gateway to spiritual warfare. That is, by watching this type of content, many people could be, without realizing it, exposing themselves to demonic influences. Billy Graham's warning was not an empty speech. He always based his words on the Bible, and in this case, the reference was clear. Ephesians 6:12 reminds us that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world. For him, films like The Exorcist were part of a much larger movement, the normalization of spiritual evil. When the devil becomes just a movie character, people stop taking spiritual warfare seriously. And when that happens, they become easy targets. The curious thing is that Graham was not the only one to realize this. Many religious leaders of the time warned about the effects of the film on the audience. There were reports of people who, after watching the film, began to have recurring nightmares, felt strange presences in their homes and, in some cases, sought churches to receive prayers of deliverance. These effects were not only psychological, some claimed that the feeling of oppression was real, something that went beyond the simple fear provoked by a horror work. And here comes an important point. If Billy Graham was right, it means that The Exorcist was more than just a movie. It could be a tool to spread spiritual deception and weaken people's resistance to the occult. After all, fear is one of the enemy's most powerful weapons. And when one gets used to fear, one loses the ability to react. This would explain why so many horror productions focus on possession, exorcism, and the feeling of powerlessness in the face of evil. Graham also warned of another danger: the obsession with exorcism without spiritual understanding. Many watched the film and, instead of moving away from the occult, became even more interested in the subject. The film has raised a wave of curiosity about exorcism rituals, invocations, and practices related to the spirit world. Some people began to study the topic on their own, without discernment, and opened doors to dangerous experiences. It's as if the film serves as a kind of disguised invitation for more people to get involved with themes that the Bible clearly condemns. And this warning was not restricted to The Exorcist. Billy Graham often talked about the role of the media in building people's spiritual perception. He understood that horror was not just a genre of entertainment, but a way of shaping beliefs. After all, how many people are more afraid of the devil than fear of God? How many believe more in the power of evil than in the force of good? Horror cinema has created a generation that fears the devil but does not recognize Christ's authority over him. The big question here is not just whether The Exorcist was inspired by evil, but what the real impact of this film was over the decades. Even after so many years, it remains considered the scariest movie of all time. Is this just a cinematic merit, or is there something else behind this influence? If Billy Graham was right, then the question we must ask is not whether spiritual horror is real, but rather what is being done to keep it spreading. What if the impact of this film was not limited to the past? What if its influence was still shaping the way people view the occult and exorcism today? Entertainment continues to explore these themes intensively, and the next question we must address is how much of this can be considered just fiction, and how much reflects a larger strategy. Modern entertainment has become a powerful tool for disseminating ideas, shaping beliefs, and, in many cases, influencing human behavior without people even realizing it. Movies, series, and even music carry messages that go far beyond what is seen on the surface. And when it comes to the occult, demonic possession, and the normalization of spiritual horror, the entertainment industry seems to have a special interest in keeping these themes trendy. But is all this just a coincidence? Or are we facing a well-designed strategy to make spiritual deception more accessible and acceptable? Many film directors have admitted that they consult with occultists, demonologists, and practitioners of real magic to ensure that their scripts are authentic. This means that many of the incantations, symbols, and rituals shown in horror movies aren't merely invented. They're taken from actual spiritual practices. In other words, what some people think of as fiction may actually be a faithful representation of rituals practiced in the spirit world. The problem is that by watching this content without discernment, many people end up allowing such influences to enter their lives without them realizing it. Cinema has always flirted with the occult, but in recent years there has been a significant change. Before, movies portrayed spiritual horror as something to be fought. Good always triumphed in the end. Today, the scenario is different. Many productions exalt evil, portray darkness as something fascinating, and in some cases, even make the audience root for the wrong side. Demonic villains have become cult icons, and characters who practice witchcraft are presented as heroes. This may seem harmless at first glance, but at its core, there is a normalization of what the Bible clearly warns is dangerous. And the most curious? Rarely do you see movies that portray the power of God overcoming spiritual evil. In many of these productions, priests and exorcists are shown as weak, powerless, or unable to cope with the force of the devil. Fear is always more present than faith. But is this just a creative decision or part of something bigger? If there is a spiritual war going on, it makes sense that one of the first steps to weaken the side of good is precisely to portray it as ineffective and powerless. The influence of entertainment on the way we see the world cannot be underestimated. How many people had their first contact with the occult through a movie? How many started to believe more in ghosts, spirits, and entities after watching a series on the subject? And how many have become desensitized to spiritual horror because of constant exposure to this type of content? The danger is not only in what is seen, but in what is internalized. What enters through the eyes and ears eventually shapes the perception of reality. Many ignore these details, but the Bible itself warns us about the importance of watching what we consume. In Philippians 4:8, there is clear counsel. Whatever is true, whatever is honest, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, if there is any virtue and if there is any praise, think about it. But is this generation really following this instruction? Or are they, without realizing it, becoming more and more exposed to ideas that weaken their spiritual resistance? And there is another important point. Spiritual deception rarely happens abruptly. It is gradual. No one becomes a practitioner of the occult overnight. First, it becomes normal to see witchcraft in movies. Later, some people begin to think that it is okay to play with boards or perform rituals as a form of curiosity. And when they realize it, they have already opened doors that they cannot close. The problem never starts with something big. It always starts with small concessions. That's why the warning about entertainment is not something exaggerated. If the content we consume shapes our mind and influences our beliefs, it makes sense to reflect on what kind of message is constantly being conveyed. How many movies glorify exorcism but never mention the power of God? How many series portray the occult as something harmless, fun, or even necessary? These ideas, repeated over and over again, create a distorted perception of the spirit world. And when the truth is distorted, people lose the ability to see the real danger. But does all this happen randomly? Or is there a greater intention behind the normalization of spiritual horror? After all, if there is a spiritual war, it makes sense that one of the enemy's strategies is to make people believe that he does not exist. And the best way to achieve this is through entertainment. But what does the Bible really say about these topics? Are there clear warnings about the danger of the occult and constant exposure to these influences? The answer can be found in Scripture, and what is written can completely change how we view what we watch. The Bible has never been ambiguous about the occult, witchcraft, and any kind of involvement with obscure spiritual practices. Since the Old Testament, God has warned his people about the dangers of these influences. At Deuteronomy 18:10-12, there is a direct warning. There will not be found among you anyone who makes his son or his daughter pass through the fire, nor a soothsayer, nor a soothsayer, nor a sorcerer, nor a sorcerer, nor a soothsayer, nor a sorcerer, nor a sorcerer, nor anyone who inquires of a spirit of soothsaying, nor one who inquires of the dead. For everyone who does such a thing is an abomination to the Lord. There is no middle ground here. Involvement with the occult is not treated as something harmless or cultural, but as something condemned by God. Many people believe that watching movies, playing spirit games, or exploring content about demonic possession is of no consequence, but the Bible teaches otherwise. The problem is not only in the action itself, but in what it can generate spiritually. Ephesians 4:27 warns us, "Do not give place to the devil." This means that when someone engages in these practices, even if it's out of curiosity or entertainment, they may be opening spiritual doors to something they don't fully understand. And once a door is opened, it's not always easy to close it. Looking at the history of the people of Israel, we see numerous examples of how involvement with the occult has always had negative consequences. King Saul, for example, consulted a witch in Endor, 1 Samuel 28:7-20, to try to communicate with the prophet Samuel. This decision was a milestone in his ruin. He had already been rejected by God due to his disobedience, but this act was confirmation of his downfall. The next day, he was defeated in battle and died. This episode shows how seeking guidance in the occult can lead to disastrous results. And if anyone thinks that this is just an Old Testament issue, the New Testament reinforces that warning. Acts 19:19 describes a landmark event in the city of Ephesus, where many who practiced magic and sorcery decided to abandon these practices and publicly burn their books of incantations. This episode was not only symbolic, it represented a real break with the occult. People understood that they could not follow Christ and, at the same time, maintain ties with spiritual practices that came from the enemy. The big question here is, if the Bible is so clear about the dangers of the occult, why do so many people still insist on treating it as something harmless? The answer may lie in the very deception that Satan has created over the centuries. He doesn't appear as a scary monster. He presents himself as something fascinating, intriguing, and often even funny. 2 Corinthians 11:14 warns us, and no wonder, because Satan himself disguises himself as an angel of light. And isn't that exactly what modern entertainment has done? Transformed the darkness into something seductive? The devil's greatest trick has always been to convince the world that he doesn't exist. And one of the most effective ways to do this is to normalize your presence in popular culture. When movies and TV shows portray the occult as commonplace, people stop seeing it as a real danger. Over time, spiritual resistance weakens and doors begin to open. Small concessions turn into big traps. Another detail that many overlook is that by consuming this type of content, the person is not just passively watching. They are allowing certain concepts to enter their mind and become part of their reality. Proverbs 4:23 teaches us, "Above all things to be guarded, guard your heart, for out of it come the goings of life." This means that what we consume affects who we become. If we constantly feed on fear, anguish, and spiritual horror, we cannot expect to live a life of peace and balance. And there's another point that can't be ignored. Many of the things that are represented in these films are real rituals. Invocations, symbols, and words uttered in scenes of exorcism or possession are not random. They are elements drawn from authentic occult practices. This means that some people may be unknowingly participating in rituals while watching these movies. Does it seem exaggerated? Well, know that many priests and demonologists have already stated that watching certain content can create unwanted spiritual connections. The point is not to demonize entertainment, but to discern what is consumed. If the Bible warns us about the dangers of the occult, it means that we should not play with these matters. God does not forbid something without reason. He knows the spiritual consequences of certain practices. But is this generation willing to listen? Or has society ever been so desensitized by spiritual deception that it prefers to treat it all as a grand fantasy? What if the problem wasn't just the consumption of the occult, but the way it's being used to manipulate people's views on spiritual warfare? What would happen if, without realizing it, we were being trained to ignore the real danger? Satan's greatest trick was not to create an army of avowed followers, but to convince the world that he does not exist. Over the generations, the image of the devil has been transformed into something increasingly caricatured, almost a joke. Today, he is portrayed as an irrelevant figure, a cartoon character with horns and trident, or even an anti-hero in series and movies. The result? Society has lost its fear of spiritual evil. And when you don't fear something, you don't protect yourself from it. If we look back, we will see that in ancient times, the occult was feared and avoided. Today, it is everywhere, in fashion, in music, in cinema, and even in children's literature. Children grow up consuming stories about witchcraft and invocations as if they were mere adventures. Teenagers become interested in tarot, astrology, and spells as an innocent pastime. All of this seems harmless until someone crosses a boundary of no return. The Bible already warned about this in Isaiah 5:20. Woe to those who call evil good and call good evil. And isn't that exactly what we see? What was once rejected is now celebrated. One of the biggest signs of this change is in the way the devil and exorcism are portrayed in entertainment. How many productions show evil as something seductive, strong, and uncontrollable? In contrast, how many movies or series show God as the winner in the end? The pattern is always the same. Spiritual terror always seems more powerful than any attempt to combat it. This is no coincidence. It is a constant subliminal message that weakens people's faith. Another clear example of this strategy is modern skepticism. While the popular media treats the occult as something mystical and fascinating, any mention of spiritual warfare in the biblical perspective is ridiculed. If someone talks about Satan and his plans, he is labeled a religious fanatic. But if a movie portrays demonic possession as something real and scary, everyone accepts it without question. This is the modern paradox. Society rejects belief in the devil, but avidly consumes content that exalts him. And the manipulation does not stop there. In many intellectual and academic circles, everything connected with the spirit world is treated as superstition. The idea that there is spiritual warfare is dismissed as paranoia. This is curious because the same society that rejects these beliefs promotes serious studies of energies, universe, and cosmic vibrations. Modern occultism has been disguised as science, while faith has been labeled as ignorance. But who gains from this inversion of values? The Bible is clear about the tactic of spiritual deception. In 2 Corinthians 4:4, it is written, "The God of this world has blinded the minds of unbelievers, so that the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ should not shine." This means that Satan does not need to directly destroy people's faith. He just needs to divert their attention to other things. A little distraction here, a trivialization of the occult there, and that's it. An entire world starts to live without realizing that it is in the middle of an invisible battlefield. And the greatest irony, while Christians often avoid talking about these issues so as not to appear radical, the secular world is promoting these topics in full force. Each year, the number of series, books, and films about exorcism, possession, and witchcraft only increases. Some productions go so far as to bring in occult experts to ensure that the rituals shown on screen are authentic, and people watch it without thinking twice. The question is, why? Perhaps because fear is one of the most powerful emotions. When a person feels fear, they become more vulnerable. When fear is constant, it becomes a habit. And when a habit is reinforced, it shapes the perception of reality. This is the real danger of the normalization of spiritual horror. It's not just about scares or entertainment, but a gradual desensitization that prevents people from recognizing the real enemy. And here's the crux of the point. If society no longer sees the spiritual battle around it, then Satan has already won a significant part of that war. He doesn't have to hide, just that people stop believing him. And this leads us to an even more serious question. If we are so blind to this reality, are we prepared for the impacts of this manipulation? The truth is that the spiritual warfare has never stopped. It just became more subtle. But there is something that can bring clarity to all this. The Bible gives us all the answers about how to discern and protect ourselves from this manipulation. The problem is, how many are still willing to listen? Most people live their lives without realizing that they are in the midst of a spiritual war. Unlike physical battles, this war does not happen with visible weapons or armies, but in thoughts, emotions, and daily decisions. The Bible makes it clear that there is a conflict going on behind the scenes in the natural world. Ephesians 6:12 warns us, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in the heavenly places." This means that there are unseen forces at work, trying to influence every aspect of human life. The big problem is that, because they do not see this battle, many people live as if it did not exist. The enemy works best on anonymity, which is why his greatest strategy is to keep people distracted. While they are concerned with everyday life, with their problems and momentary pleasures, they end up completely ignoring the reality of the spiritual horror around them. And when they do, they are already spiritually weakened, without the strength to resist the deception and traps that the devil spreads along the way. This war does not only manifest itself in direct attacks, as we see in cases of demonic possession or exorcism. It reveals itself in small choices, in what we consume, in what we believe, in what we let into our mind. It all starts with subtle concessions. A film here, an alternative spiritual practice there, a curiosity for the occult. And when you realize it, you are already entangled in something much bigger. Satan does not need to force anyone to worship him. He just needs to plant doubt, skepticism, and the desire for the forbidden. And how is this battle reflected in the real world? Just look at the current trends. Society has become increasingly comfortable with the occult, witchcraft, and the idea that evil can be fascinating. Witchcraft books for children have become commonplace, while Christian content is censored or ridiculed. The inversion of values is evident. What was once considered dangerous is now treated as pop culture. All of this is part of the spiritual deception that has been building for decades. The effect of this war can be seen in families, mental health, and the increase in people's spiritual emptiness. There has never been so much talk about anxiety, depression, and existential crises. People look for answers everywhere, except in the right place. The Bible already warned that in recent times many would turn away from the truth to follow doctrines of demons. 1 Timothy 4:1. Have we reached that point yet? And more than that, if there is a spiritual war, where is the training to face it? Many Christians don't even know how to protect themselves, how to discern the enemy's snares, or how to strengthen themselves spiritually. The Bible itself gives us the answer in Ephesians 6:13-17, when it speaks about the armor of God. But does this generation still care about using it? Aren't distraction and spiritual deception making people more vulnerable than ever? What we see today is a world where everything seems normal, but it is enough to look carefully to perceive the signs of battle. Each new generation is being exposed to content that is increasingly loaded with references to the occult, possession, and the exaltation of spiritual horror. And meanwhile, faith is being erased, little by little. The enemy does not need a direct attack when it can win by subtle manipulation. The truth is that this war never stopped. It just changed tactics. The question that remains is, who is really aware of what is happening? Who still has the discernment to perceive the invisible attacks? And more importantly, who is prepared to resist this influence and fight for real? The answer lies in the Bible itself. But is there still someone who is willing to listen in the midst of so many distractions? Now that you've seen all this, you can no longer say you didn't know. You have noticed how the world is being manipulated, how the occult has been normalized, and how people, without realizing it, are opening doors to influences that go far beyond what they imagine. This spiritual warfare is real, and it will not stop just because many choose to ignore it. But the question now is, what are you going to do with this knowledge? You can just go about your life as if nothing had happened, continue consuming the same content without questioning anything, or you can wake up, open your eyes, and start protecting yourself. Now you know that it's not just a movie, it's not just a story, it's not just entertainment. So will you continue to passively accept, or will you start paying attention to who is really pulling the strings behind all this? The choice is yours. But remember, ignorance does not protect anyone. In fact, that's exactly what the enemy wants. For you to think that all this is just an exaggeration, that you have no problem letting these ideas enter your mind and become part of your reality. But now you know that this is not the case. So I ask you, are you ready to fight this war, or will you continue to ignore the signs? Leave here in the comments what you think about it. Let's talk about this truth that few have the courage to expose. And before leaving, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because believe me, what comes next will open your eyes even more. And you can't be left out of this revelation.